The great housing debate. Who's to blame for Australia's biggest disaster? Coming up on this week's Citizens Report. Welcome to the Citizens Report for the 21st of May 2026. I'm Elisa Barwick. Joining me today is Citizens Party National Chairman Robert Barwick. Welcome, Robbie.
Thanks, Elisa. Also today, support the Duggans appeal. Finally, ASIO debate airs some truth, and Kiwis want a national bank.
Now help us get the word out by please sharing the show, making a comment below. Of course, if you're not already a subscriber, you can do that and ring the notification bell and also hit the like button. And you will find below various links to information that we put up so you get more background info from the show, including links to our publication and how you can donate to support us. Now, on our updates today, firstly, we have support the Duggans appeal. What's the latest, Robbie?
So this week, Safrine Duggan, who's the wife of Dan Duggan, the former US Marines Top Gun pilot turned Australian citizen who's been in an Australian prison for 3.5 years, despite being completely innocent. He's never been charged with any crime under Australian law. Safrine announced that the Duggan family will appeal the court ruling against Dan Duggan from last month. Now, that ruling essentially upheld that the government was okay to use a law retrospectively in order to meet the requirement for dual criminality that you have to meet if someone qualifies for extradition. They've got to be accused of a crime that's a crime in both countries, and in order to meet that requirement, the Albanese government applied a 2018 law to something that the Americans were accusing Dan Duggan of doing in 2012 because it wasn't illegal under Australian law. In fact, he was explicitly licensed by the Australian government to do what he did, as it turns out. Anyway, we won't go into all that. We've covered that quite a lot. But for now, what we'd like people to do is watch Safrine's video announcing this appeal, and you can help the family at freedanduggan.org.
Firstly, I would like to thank everyone who has supported us through this incredibly challenging period of our lives. We have decided to appeal the federal court decision by Justice Stelios and will be continuing in our fight for Dan's freedom and for Australian sovereignty. This is about my family and all Australians. We need to ensure that Aussies are protected. Dan was an Australian citizen working in South Africa in 2012. He broke no law, and the allegations against him were not a crime in Australia. And yet the Australian government has approved an extradition request to send an Aussie citizen, my husband and father of 6 kids, to the United States. We have been stripped of our property and we have been financially devastated by our ongoing fight for justice. We thank all of our supporters for sticking with us, and we appeal to the government to intervene. Dan, a father with no criminal record, no violent history, a man who served his country and found happiness in life in Australia, has been locked up in maximum security for 1,300 days with no Australian charges. He was subjected to 19 months of solitary confinement. We continue to fundraise to help with the legal fees and cost of living pressures, and we are grateful to those who have helped us. It's time for Dan to come home. Once again, we thank everyone so much for their support. Thank you.
Yeah, so like I said, Elisa, people can help the family at freedanduggan.org. They do not qualify for legal aid. The Americans froze their house so they couldn't sell it to fund his legal defence. They rely on the goodwill of their fellow Australians who see this, as Safrine said, as a fight for sovereignty, right? Our government would not be doing this if it wasn't the Americans after him. When the Americans jump, we say, how high, right? And it's our job to protect citizens, not to sell them down the river.
Yep, so it has big implications for all Australians if we don't fight and win this. Okay, finally, ASIO debate airs some truth. Now, last week on the show, we reported that the government had done a backflip, and suddenly they're the ones that have said they'll put forward an amendment to put back in a sunset clause that they'd removed from the rejigged legislation.
Yeah.
But what's the latest that's come up now?
Well, I'm still pinching myself that's happened, because I went back and looked at the debates back on the 12th of February in Parliament on the ASIO bill. Of course, this is the bill that will make ASIO's extreme authoritarian interrogation powers, would have made them permanent. And there was an amendment put up back in February to keep the sunset clause, and it was put up by Kate Cheney, the independent. And Tony Burke, the Home Affairs Minister, gets up there all so sincere. He goes, "Oh, we really don't want these powers. I really feel for you. Yeah. I feel for we don't want to apply them for children, but you've got to understand the need is so much greater than ever. We have to have these powers. We have to make them permanent." That was their position on the 12th of February. Thanks to our work, which has exploded the attention on this ASIO bill and caused a lot of feedback into parliamentarians, especially coalition senators. They saw the writing on the wall, and now they've said, "Oh, no, we'll keep the sunset clause, we'll keep them permanent." And now they're using the same language, Elisa. Oh, it's very important that these kinds of powers remain in check, and that's why sunset clauses are so important. I mean, these major party politicians, they are, they're impossible, right? They will, you cannot believe a word they say, because they will turn on a dime, and every time they establish their position on something, they bring out all the sincerity, and it's always garbage, right? They did this under the blowback from the public. But the best part of what happened last week was we recorded Thursday morning. Later in the day, there was a debate. The debate started in the Senate. They only had time for 2 senators to debate. The first one was Liberal Senator Maria Kovacic. She went through all the routine. Oh, we've got to support ASIO, etc. These are times we need these kinds of powers, and she mentioned the sunset clause. Yes, it's very important we keep the sunset clause. But then David Pocock got up, and I mean, I hope Pocock is growing on our viewers as much as he's growing on us, right? Because David Pocock, to me, is a testament to the fact that Parliament needs independence. In fact, Parliament would work better if everyone was an independent, right? Now, it's probably impractical to not have any parties, but anyway, he's a true independent, and you don't have to agree with him on everything, but when he takes a stand because he's looked at an issue, right, it's an independent stand. And he got up and he gave a speech, and he went through just expressing someone not in the major party saying, hang on, you are expecting us to accept authoritarianism here, right? Why? We want to play this one little part, because this has been an issue with the bill, and I'm really glad he raised it, because he essentially cut through all the excuses by the government opposition about why these powers are so important, and he singled out some powers, and look who he cites as the authority saying that they're not even necessary. Have a look.
But even with the sunset clause restored, the bill still asks Australians to accept things we should not have to accept. In its current form, the bill retains ASIO's power to compulsorily question children as young as 14. Children who have not been charged with an offence. Children who may never be charged with any offence. The standard is not criminal suspicion, it is whether the Attorney-General believes intelligence gathering is warranted. Reassuringly, ASIO has never used this power, not once in 22 years. And 2 years ago, ASIO itself told a PJSIS review of Division 3 of Part 3 of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation Act 1979 that, and I'll quote, "We no longer see a strong case to support the continuance of the power to question minors under warrants." The Department of Home Affairs also made a submission to a similar effect. I'll read their submission to the 2024 review. The Department suggests it is also important that minor questioning warrants be considered in light of their proportionality and the need to protect the rights and interests of vulnerable people. As an intrusive and extraordinary power, the carrying out of a minor compulsory questioning warrant would be confronting and difficult for the minor involved, with potentially enduring ramifications. The powers were introduced at an exceptional moment in world and Australian affairs, and the Department suggests it is appropriate to reflect on whether it remains necessary to maintain such an extraordinary and intrusive power. So we've got ASIO and the Department of Home Affairs saying it doesn't look like this power is actually necessary. ASIO says you should probably drop it. Department of Home Affairs says we should consider it. But the government has now walked away from that advice with no real explanation and is asking the Senate to write it permanently into the statute book.
So it's ASIO itself, Elisa,
Yeah.
and the Home Affairs Department.
Yep.
What's his name? Tony Burke's own department. In 2024, they were saying, yeah, we don't need to have powers to interrogate kids. We've never used them. We don't need them. That's what they said in 2024. Then they had an election, and suddenly it's like, no, we need... ASIO had a submission after the election saying, oh, we need these powers to interrogate kids. Home Affairs did the same thing. So they had a position before, and then they completely backflipped, right? Something has happened. There was an expectation that they could try and make these kind of things more reasonable because they do understand that these are extreme authoritarian powers. And then there was an intervention by somebody, we don't know who, and now they're demanding, no, these powers have to be as extreme as we can make them, and they have to apply to everything ASIO does, right? So David Pocock's speech was an absolute breath of fresh air in that debate. What happens now, Elisa, is the Senate will not sit again until the 22nd of June. Parliament resumes next week for 2 weeks, and during that time they have what's called Senate estimates, where the senators are in committee and ask questions. So the Senate chamber is not in operation until the 22nd of June. So the bill will not be debated until then. We have an opportunity, and we're putting out a statement about this today. You can look it up on our website. Given that we've got them to backflip on the sunset clause and keep these powers temporary, what about some of these other aspects? If ASIO itself said they didn't need them for kids because they've never used them, right? Let's start, when you keep hammering your members of parliament, especially your senators, especially your coalition senators, just keep hammering them and say, why, if ASIO said you don't need to be able to interrogate kids, why are you insisting on keeping the powers to interrogate kids, right? That's one. The other one that I suggest that and it's in the statement, is about the separation of powers. One of the arguments that's come up in relation to these laws, these powers, is that ASIO hasn't abused them because, and so therefore you should be able to trust ASIO, because the reason we know it hasn't abused them because they've only used them 20 times since they were first legislated 23 years ago. You know, that's the proof. Now, there's an argument that says, Elisa, well, yeah, but in all that time they had a sunset clause and they knew that they'd always be looked at, how they used it,
they're answerable.
right? So by removing the sunset clause, there's no guarantee that ASIO would have remained so constrained. That's one argument. But the other argument is this, okay, well, if they've only used them 20 times in 23 years, then it's not onerous to require ASIO to go to a judge to get a warrant rather than the Attorney General. Because when the Attorney General gives a warrant to ASIO, that's the executive authorising the executive.
Yeah.
There's no separation of powers. The separation of powers is a legal principle that is a cornerstone of our democratic systems, right? Where there's 3 separate branches of government. When it comes to law enforcement, the executive must be overseen by the judiciary, all right? Down to the level of the judiciary granting warrants for arrests and questioning and things like that. That's not onerous, therefore, to require that. And we might even be able to change that. So we've got till the 22nd of June to really hit this. So hammer them on child interrogations, hammer them on the separation of powers, and we'll keep on the case.
Now, you have done, as an activist, an excellent job in bringing this to the public attention, but I just wanted to mention a stark contrast, and we'll make this available with a link below. we put together some of the headlines from the 2002-2003 period when we were fighting the first incarnation of this bill, when it was put forward the first time. It had gone through the lower house and then it came to the Senate, and suddenly, including with thanks to a role by us, an explosion of controversy erupted, and it's interesting to look at the coverage and then look at the headlines about the back down and how the teeth of the laws were pulled due to the mobilising that we did at that time. And also, you know, very important that we did this work, because most of these articles, having searched a bunch of them to try and find the headlines, are not available online.
No.
Like, there's no trace of it. So
You've got a good archive though.
fortunately, we have good archives and we're able to take photos of some of the headlines so that you can see we didn't just make this all up. But man, the contrast between that and today is absolutely stunning.
Well, and Lisa, not to blow our own horn, but sometimes we've got to, because no one else is going to blow it for us. We did play the key role back then. I remember when John Howard unveiled these 8 anti-terrorism bills in 2002, we're looking at them going, man, this is, Australia's heading down the path of outright fascism here, right? And there was our office headquarters is in Coburg. There was a public meeting being held in Fitzroy to talk about these laws. And so a couple of us went along, I was one of them. And we go to that meeting and there are all these tired old lefties who you know, who've been fighting the government since the Vietnam War days. Good on them, right? I'm just saying that there was like 30 people in a room or something.
Yeah.
And they were like, oh, what can we do about this? And they just had no drive whatsoever. And one of the man leading the meeting, he would say, oh, who can we call in Parliament? And someone said, oh, I know this member of Parliament, I'll call that office. And someone else said, oh, I know this one, I'll call that office. And I'm looking at this and going, this is not going to do anything. So I stood up and said, put down the Citizens Party for 1,000 calls to everyone. And they're like,
what?
Right? Anyway, that's what we did. We set up a phone bank here. We mobilised all of our supporters. We had people, our state secretaries, etc., all came to Melbourne, spent weeks here on the phone. We just flooded Parliament with calls. Labor started off, its position was to endorse every single one of the bills, the laws, including the original ASIO powers, because 9/11 had just happened and no one wanted to be seen to be not being tough on terrorism, right? Because of what we organised, that shifted. Labor shifted and it turned into a 15-month bun fight to get those powers passed, and they only passed because Labor, they eventually put a sunset clause on them. And in that 15 months, that's when people like Albanese, as we've shown in the past, came forward and gave fiery speeches and compared the powers to the Nazis, right? Confirming what we were saying, that these were fascism. So we did that. The Citizens Party did that.
It took them nearly 2 years to get that legislation up.
Yeah, no,
It was a fait accompli at the start. They got it through the House.
It would have been done in a couple of weeks. We did that, right?
Yep.
And now we're the ones that are leading the charge to blow the whistle on the nature of what they're trying to continue here and make sure they're not. Remember, I said last week, what they stated explicitly in the Senate in the parliamentary report, they wanted to remove the sunset clause to normalise these powers. We have stopped that, and we can do a lot more between now and the 22nd of June.
All right, now this one is a fantastic update.
Yeah.
Kiwis want a national bank.
Woohoo! Now, Kiwis have a national bank, Elisa. The long-term viewers will know that we've been big fans of Kiwi Bank, which started off as a postal bank, right? So it is the Kiwis have a government-owned bank. However, there's an election coming up, and the erstwhile Winston Peters, who's actually the Foreign Minister of New Zealand, but he's also the head of the minor political party in the coalition government, which is called New Zealand First, and he's a wild maverick kind of guy, so I definitely wouldn't agree with him on everything, but that's not, doesn't matter. I'm not a New Zealander, right? I'm an Aussie. However, we do have something in common, which is banks, because New Zealand's banks are Australia's banks. Australia's banks own them. And the other thing we have in common is those banks are owned by Americans, so they're not even really Australian banks. But anyway, so facing the election at the end of the year, New Zealand First launched their policy platform, And out of the blue, and I saw this on Sky News Australia yesterday, and Ross Greenwood was saying, where did this harebrained idea come from? Out of the blue, Winston Peters has just overturned the chessboard and said, we are going to renationalise Bank of New Zealand. So we'll play the clip from Sky News where you can see what he's doing. But the specific proposal, before we do that, is they are going to, he said, we're going to buy back the Bank of New Zealand from the National Australia Bank, and you'll see him talking about this and justifying it, and merge it with Kiwi Bank to make a big, powerful national bank for New Zealand that can really take on the big Aussie banks, the big American-owned Aussie banks, right? Anyway, run the clip.
We have a second campaign policy to announce today. New Zealand First will be buying back the BNZ Bank. Four Australian-owned banks control around 85% of our system. They lend our deposits back to us at margins that are materially higher than those earned by their parent groups in Australia. Billions of dollars of profits a year then flow across the Tasman. New Zealand First will be proposing a buyback of the Bank of New Zealand from the National Australia Bank. And remember, it was sold by the National Party in total, started first by Labor in part. Labor started in April of 1987 and National completed the sale in November of 1992 of the privatisation of BNZ. And they sold it to the NAB for 1.1 billion Australian, or today, Australia with inflation, 3.5 billion. The next thing the media are going to start shouting out, what are you going to pay for it, Mr. Peters? Well, we're starting with those things in our memory, all right? We ain't going to be ripped off like we were last time. We're proposing to buy back the Bank of New Zealand from National Australia Bank, and it'll be merged with Kiwi Bank to form the National Bank of New Zealand.
So that's great.
And I'll tell you something, he referred to it. This is quite important. Our banks here, Elisa, are the most profitable banks in the world. The big four Australian banks are among the most profitable banks in the world. Now, their profits they make include their profits from New Zealand. Their New Zealand profits per capita are higher than their Australian profits. They have been plundering that country, absolutely plundering it, right? And the Kiwis are saying, we're sick of it. So follow this closely, the debate in New Zealand, right? It's fascinating how this is going to play out. I would say, as a technical thing, and again, it's not my business, but as a technical thing, they actually don't, I would argue, they don't need to renationalise Bank of New Zealand. Just turn Kiwi Bank into what it can be. Really fire it up, put more capital into it and fire it up. Take on the banks at their own game. It'll slay them, right? So you can save that big amount of taxpayer money if necessary in terms of buying it. But nevertheless, the intent is spot on, right? And you're going to see the powers that be absolutely squeal. The question is, what do the people want? And it'll be interesting how that plays out. We need the same kind of thinking here. But what we would do is, I wouldn't even bother. The only thing I would do instead of trying to buy back the Commonwealth Bank, the only thing I would do is force it to change its name, because Commonwealth means government, Australian government. It should have not been allowed to keep that name when it was privatised. That was a huge travesty. I'd also say we should also use the word, tell National Australia Bank, stop using the word national, because that also means owned by the public, right? So we should, apart from that, all we need to do is start a bank with a retail side in post offices that actually serves people, and you will see a transformation of banking in Australia.
So we need politicians that are brave enough to do what Peters did and raise it, and you can help that by putting the pressure on for this approach. And
I'm looking at you, Matt Canavan. You chaired an inquiry. You chaired an inquiry into bank closures in regional Australia. You recommended the government investigate a public bank, and you're not saying anything, right? Do you stand behind your recommendations? You could make a difference.
It's 2 years since that committee reported.
Exactly. This
So,
Sunday, Elisa, is the
good chance to
second
do it.
anniversary. The second
Yeah.
anniversary of the best inquiry report we've ever seen, because we had a role in it. We contributed to the recommendations. Matt Canavan chaired it. But remember, Jared Rennick, former Senator now, Jared Rennick, got it up. We worked with him to get it
Yeah.
up. He's the one who took the lead on making sure this inquiry happened. He shared with us the objective that we need to make sure that it recommends a public bank, and we did. That's what we achieved. It's been ignored by the Albanese government for 2 years now. Right? That's not acceptable. They usually have, the law says they've got 90 days to respond to an inquiry. They've ignored it for 2 years. And meanwhile, we're in a cost of living crisis and our banks just keep raking it in.
Yeah. Now, we're going to continue talking about those exact themes via a specific policy issue in our next topic, the great housing debate. Who's to blame for Australia's biggest disaster? So it's what we've identified in our Australian Alert this week is that it's the policy, you couldn't call it a policy drift really, because it's been an instigated policy direction shift away from governments having any say in the economy whatsoever to handing it all to the free market, which essentially means in the free market, you know, it's laissez-faire, anything goes. So the strongest players are going to dominate. That's what happens. You know, and you can look at examples throughout history. You can look at what's happened in the period since we introduced that with the various tax changes that left the housing market to the free market and that took out a government role in provision of housing. You know, we've had this entire decades-long, multi-decade period for the market to solve the problems faced in the housing sector. It hasn't happened. So what we need to look at is real policy change, not fiddling with the market settings, which is basically what the government is proposing to do in the latest budget. Some of those changes are good changes. Some of the taxation policy changes are in the right direction. However, alone, it will not suffice.
Well, and it's going to blow back on the government, because what happened is the government said, we have to address this imbalance, which is a real imbalance, where because of a change made in 1999, ever since that at every auction, housing auction in Australia since 1999, investors have had a tax advantage over home buyers, and they have outbid them, 9 times out of 10. Right? That's what's happened since 1999 in Australia because of the change Peter Costello made. And that was Peter Costello fiddling the dial, right, on the free market settings. All right, we're changing it to this now. So it changed the settings and the market adapted, but it adapted where the banks said to all these people, hey, we're not going to lend you money to buy a house, but we'll lend you money to become an investor, right? And all these extra investors went in the market. And one of the things that did, Elisa, was, so it didn't seem quite as painful as what's happening now. We'll get to what's happening now. But over time it's become painful because it drove up house prices so much, right? It's priced people out of the market. So Albanese's come along and Chalmers and said, okay, we've finally got to address that imbalance. We've got to turn the dial back. But that's all they're doing, and they expect the market to adapt again. But this time, because for a quarter of a century people have got used to how this is done, it's effectively pulling the rug out from under a huge number of them in terms of their expectations of what they're going to achieve. Because is the government saying to these young people, we actually want prices to come down? No, they want prices to stay up, right? Or you're just going to have, an advantage in this way. But then the young people are saying, well, hang on, I had hoped, I was being told by my financial advisor that the way to be able to afford a deposit is to play the game in this way, and you're taking that off us, right? And what we said in the alert this week is the problem is just this idea of fiddling the dials, right? That imbalance had to be addressed, but it's up to the government to say, how do we make sure this disaster ends? The disaster of unaffordable housing, the biggest economic disaster in our history, because it's a 25-year mess. It's become a cancer on our economy. How do we properly fix that? And the free market ain't going to do it.
No. No, because as you say, the rug's been pulled from under people because they're used to this way of doing it, and there's no going back. We burnt the bridge behind us.
Pretty much.
There's no real economy because all the policies that also brought the free market to housing, to the housing sector, brought it to industry and everything across the board, every service. So as we privatised banking, and so we took from the purview of government any role in directing credit into certain important sectors of the economy and left it to whatever was more profitable for the private banks to do. As we all know, it's more profitable for banks to lend to mortgages, and they've got certain weighted riskings and things that also help on that front. The government pours bonuses and all kinds into the housing sector. But when it comes to productive and business lending, there's not the same compulsion for banks to lend. But then we also had the privatisation of state assets and the sell-off of vital infrastructure. We gutted things like TAFE that provided skilled labour. We deregulated every industry. So, it was, again, this laissez-faire approach of anything goes, meaning everything concentrated into a small handful of producers, like in areas like dairy, for instance. And productive industries, manufacturing, we can put up the graph of manufacturing because you see it coincides with that same 1990s period, the complete collapse of manufacturing, where the economy became focused on financial services
and
that
housing.
Underpinned the housing market, that underpinned this non-productive economy, this investment economy.
If you look at that chart, Elisa, so the manufacturing in Australia peaked in 1966 and it was just sinking like a stone. Now that's, people who know statistics will know that, because of the scale on the horizontal scale on the bottom there, that looks quite dramatic. But in reality, it is dramatic. It's just come down a long way to 5%. But we went from 13% manufacturing in 1990, when the reforms that have shaped Australia today started, to 5% by 2020, in 30 years, right? 5%. And manufacturing went from being the biggest sector of the economy, even in 1990 at 13%, still the biggest sector of the economy, to be replaced by financial services, became the bigger, and construction the second biggest, all around this housing bubble, right? And so you're right, they burned the bridge because we don't have an economy anymore that's used to making the majority of its income from production, from productive industries, right? And so this became the focus of the economy. But before we go on, we really should put up this other chart on home ownership. Now this is a bit old, this is from 2010. But this chart here actually shows you what happened when we had a productive economy with rising manufacturing, because home ownership in Australia peaked in the same year as manufacturing peaked. We hit 73% home ownership rate in 1966, right? It's not coincidental. We were in a productive economy. People had jobs. They could afford to go to the bank and borrow money to buy a home, right? That was the economy. And by changing the nature of the economy, we've changed everything. And so, by the way, that home ownership rate now is down to 63%, right? It's 10% down from the high. And we need to restructure the economy to start doing real things again, right? If we're going to replace this cancer in a way that doesn't just pull the rug out from under people, but serves them.
And so before we drill a bit more into housing, the economic sectors where there needs to be a public presence, you listed them.
Yeah, so what are we going to do? So one of the very obvious things government should do in this regard is, when it comes to housing, is go back to what it used to do and be a public presence in the housing market itself. How did it used to do that? It wasn't out there competing. It wasn't attending auctions to outcompete you at an auction. The government took responsibility to build public housing. That's what it did. Most people would not have a clue of the scale we're talking about, Elisa. It's mind-blowing. In 1949 to 1961, 24% 1947, 1961, 24% of all new housing in Australia was public housing, built by governments. It's a quarter. And then for the next period, 61 to 76, it was 23%. Governments built a quarter of all housing in Australia. The mechanism, by the way, is the Commonwealth Bank lent the state housing commissions the money to do this. That's how we kept housing affordable in those years where home ownership peaked in 1966, right? That's how we did it. So that's where the government has to go back into that sector, right? Get back involved in building housing themselves. I dare say, if you did do this, now a lot of people talk about red tape and they complain about red tape in the construction sector. If government actually got back into housing itself, right, and had to do it itself, you might see a lot of that red tape disappear, right? Because then they finally, these stupid bureaucrats realise what they've been imposing on people all the time. Because, I mean, obviously regulation is important, but red tape, suffocating regulation is not. So that's one area. Obviously, the big area is banking. We need a government bank to do this. That's how the model worked last time. You've got to have a government bank to invest in the things of the economy. And then there's a whole list where you've got to keep having a government role. The government should be involved in insurance. We talk about this, right? If you had a government insurance office, you can make sure that you insure the greatest number of people for the lowest possible price and let the private insurers compete, because right now left up to just private insurers, what do? They just skim the cream off the top, right? And they ignore anyone who they think it's not viable for them to insure to maintain the profits they want to maintain, right? Whereas the government, we set up a century ago, we set up government insurance offices so almost everybody could get insured. And that makes the economy work better anyway. Obviously, utilities, electricity, gas, water should all be government owned. This is crazy. Some of our states still have government owned utilities. But even the ones that do, like Queensland, are bound by laws where they have to overcharge the people of Queensland for their electricity because they have to officially compete under national competition policy with the private generators in the south on the national electricity market, right? And it's just garbage. Scrap it all, scrap the national electricity market, go back to state housing, state electricity commissions providing electricity like we did for a century. It's been nuts ever since we've privatised it. Clearly, infrastructure. I mean, can we stop? It's a joke. In the 90s, we started this program of privatised infrastructure. We got Macquarie Bank to build our roads for us. And you know what they did? They put massive tolls on them and they made them incredibly expensive to drive around on, right? Because the purpose of that infrastructure is not to make us more productive, it's to make profits for them, right? Go back to public infrastructure and you can fund it with a national bank. And here's some other ones just for while we're on a roll. Airlines. We used to have a national carrier. I've just finished reading the book, by the way, The Chairman's Lounge. One of the most disgusting things about Qantas is it still calls itself the national carrier. No, it's not a national carrier. It hasn't been a national carrier since it was privatised in the mid-90s. This is now a rapacious corporation that takes pleasure in screwing its customers for its shareholders, right? And it has received so much public money over the years. We should have renationalised it. Every other country in the world has a real national carrier, essentially, right? Almost all the airlines around the world are government owned, including Air New Zealand. But we gave that up, and we've had this airline private monopoly ever since. Railways and public transport should be publicly owned. And the other one is that we're coming to regret is shipping, because we're an island nation and we should have our own shipping line. In World War I, the government then realised our biggest vulnerability in Australia was not having Australian-owned shipping, and the government, using money from the Commonwealth Bank, went and bought a fleet of ships called this, and they called it later the Commonwealth Shipping Line, right? We need to have shipping if you're an island nation, because you've got to, and you'll make use of it at all times, but you really know you need it in a situation like this. That's the kind of approach we've got to get back to having in the economy. You make sure that you have a public role that does those things and just keeps a basic function in each sector working properly, and let the private sector provide all the fancy services and all that to compete at that level. The economy will work better.
Right, we're going to get back to housing, but here's how you can join us first.
You deserve a future where the people, not entrenched power, determines Australia's direction. That's why you should join the Citizens Party. You need post offices and regional bank branches to remain open. A government that invests in people, not submarines that will never arrive. And a foreign policy that's in our national interest. We've stopped the cash ban legislation and led the fight to hold major banks to account. Tens of thousands of Australians have signed our petitions, and it's made a real difference. It's time for action as we push towards our goal of 10,000 members. Join the Citizens Party at citizensparty.org.au and be part of the movement that's shaping Australia's future.
All right, now I wanted to come back to housing because we want to talk a bit more about the shift that occurred at the time of the when the capital gains tax discount came in and other things. But just to preface it, you were talking about when the government built housing, a quarter of all housing up until 1976. I wanted to note that over those years, housing stock growth by percentage outstripped population growth. And that actually continued after 1976 up until 1991. The housing stock increased at a much faster rate than the population, even through 1991. These are all these figures, including the quarter that the government built, come from a paper by Saul Eslake that was submitted to a 2013 inquiry on housing affordability. But thereafter, the percentage contributed by the government, so up from 1976 to 1991, the government only contributed the building of 9% of dwellings. And then in the mid-1950s to 70s, it continued to plummet. They were building about 15,000 homes a year. And then from the 70s through the 90s, it dropped to around the 12,000 mark on average per year. And since then, it plummeted to 4,000 to 6,000 per year. Of course, these days, we're lucky if we're doing that.
It'd be impressive if we were doing that.
Those figures went up to 2013. But I wanted to mention immigration because one thing that we looked at, which you can read, we'll put the link to the article below, is two deals that our government signed with India, which hugely boosted immigration from about 2022-23, and this was the lead up was of course during the period of the Morrison government, but it also coincided with a huge anti-China emphasis, recruiting and winning over India to work more closely within the Quad, the strategic formation, and within the other Anglo-American projects to distance or isolate China. And so we had two programs, the Australia-India Migration and Mobility Partnership Arrangement and the Mobility Arrangement for Talented Early Professionals Scheme. So these were brought in by the Albanese government but had originated earlier. So the first one is capped at 3,000 places and brings in graduates with targeted qualifications that can stay for a year but then afterwards can apply for permanent residency. And the other scheme targets creates 5-year student visas with no cap on numbers at all, again, who can apply for permanent residency thereafter. And that actually meant, which was probably the intention, that the Chinese diaspora community was no longer the greatest force in Australian politics. Rather, it was the largest ethnic minority and voting bloc. Yeah.
And we're definitely suspicious that was deliberate, right? Because people should not. Our concern in talking about immigration is we don't want people to hold it against the immigrants themselves, right? But there's a lot of talk out there about the total explosion in Indian immigration. And if this was done for geopolitical purposes, because Scott Morrison, followed by Albanese, decided, we need to, because the Americans want us to, we need to, start cutting ties with China, including diaspora ties, and start becoming all chummy with India. And so we'll say to India, hey, let all your people come in, right? Yeah. If that's why it was done, that's terrible, right? People should actually look through what the government's actual motives are. But one other aspect of it, Elisa, which was clearly has been an intention for a long time, is they used it as a Ponzi scheme. Housing keeps getting to this point where it wobbles because the boundary condition for the housing bubble, the part that starts putting under pressure, is the affordability. You know, there's a upper limit to what people can pay. If prices just keep going up and up, there's an upper limit to what people can pay. And so, like any Ponzi scheme, if you're running out of the ability to pay with the people you got, you bring in more people. And that's what has definitely been a motivation since the global financial crisis, actually, with population. They started doing it to prop up Australia during the global financial crisis and prop up the housing market, because by propping up the housing market, they're propping up the banks. And the governments have continued that ever since, and the biggest surge has been since COVID.
And our point also, of course, as I prefaced it with, is that if you need to bring in skilled labour, etc., which we often will need to do, you know, you have to have government programs to build the housing to outstrip population growth. And similarly, as we did in the post-World War II period, large-scale infrastructure projects, particularly to develop undeveloped regions of the inland where we need to settle people.
We had a massive immigration program in the decade or so after World War II. We went out looking for people. We went to refugee camps all across Europe saying, send your people to us. We signed agreements with governments all across Europe saying, send your people to us. But why? Not because we wanted to cram them into Sydney,
no,
but because there were projects being built all around Australia, and you can go to towns around the Snowy Mountains scheme and they're full of people who are descended from immigrants from post-war Europe. You go to Tassie and you'll see people in Tassie, because Tassie had this massive, the Tas Hydro construction program. You'll see lots of descendants from post-war immigrants down in Tassie, right? We brought them here for a specific purpose. We wanted them to be here, to become Australians, to stay here, but we didn't want them to just, it's like what we're talking before with the market approach. We didn't want to just say, here, we're just going to expand the market, change that setting and let it adapt. No.
Yeah.
We had a vision and we got them here to make it happen.
Yes, that's right. Now, honing in on that vision and how it changed. So the capital tax gain discount and associated negative gearing changes and so forth came about in 1999. And we want to look a bit at how that was gauged within a few years of those changes being implemented. In 2003, when the then Treasurer Peter Costello instructed the Productivity Commission to inquire into what could be then already seen as a collapse of home ownership. And so the Productivity Commission report issued in 2004 was titled First Home Ownership. And they said very blatantly that the price growth in housing was not explicable by regular market activity. And they pointed to, quote,
it wasn't, you couldn't explain it by supply and demand. That's what that actually means.
Yeah, and people just buying homes and selling homes and that kind of regular market activity. So there was something else intervening. So they pointed to, quote, interactions between negative gearing, capital works deductions, post-1999 capital gains provisions and marginal income tax rates, which was driving surging demand for housing and ensuring that it outstripped supply of housing. Right, so this was an additional mammoth demand factor, somewhat materialising out of nowhere, but not out of nowhere, because these 1999 tax changes, they explicitly said, were what, quote, heightened the attraction for individuals of investing in property, reinforcing other demand side pressures. Now, that committee called for an inquiry specifically into capital gains tax and other, well, primarily capital gains tax, but also the other things that they mentioned. As soon as practicable, a full review. Costello rejected it out of hand. In fact, at the beginning of last year, there were release of cabinet documents that happen every 30 years. And it revealed that from cabinet documents that Costello went to the cabinet, Howard and Costello, and they told the cabinet that policies, and this is a quote, policies directed at curbing investor demand may result in a disproportionate decline in house prices in a short amount of time, brackets investors fleeing the market, resulting in significant costs to household balance sheets and potentially serious impacts on the economy. In other words, we are not going to entertain that for a second, that proposal to, question the capital gains tax and other discounts, because the bubble could burst.
Yep.
Well, look how much worse it's got. Had they dealt with it now, it would have been completely different. And I just wanted to also cite the official announcement, because that was the hidden, what they said to the Cabinet. We didn't know about that. But what Costello announced in his statement that he put out publicly, it was interesting. I thought that he equated the stock market and the housing market, because as people know, these capital gains tax discounts apply across the board. It's not just housing. And a lot of voices do say we have to consider it. Even Chalmers said it. We couldn't sort of split the one and the other, which is not actually the case. We have to consider all those investment areas as one. So Costello said that the government considers the current tax arrangements provide the appropriate set of incentives in relation to investment, whether it is in housing or shares. But one of the things that we've found, because most people would be familiar with this story, maybe some wouldn't. It might be more for the boffins that read the AFR. But, one of those boffins is Jim Chalmers. So when he got up on budget night, why did he not say, hang on a minute, this is a policy error that was made by the opposition, and claim that and the independent report of the Productivity Commission for why he now had to reverse that policy?
Yeah, well, I don't know why he's not saying it either, because it is quite extraordinary. This is, he has implemented essentially what the Productivity Commission in 2004 said should have been done, right? And you're right, if they had have done it then, Elisa, they said, the market would come down. Well, the market was only, the prices had doubled in 4 years essentially, right? And if that came down a bit, people would have realised, that fund's over. But 25 years later, the expectation is this is the new normal.
Yeah.
Right? And prices had gone from 4 times income to 6 times income or something, and now they're 10 and 12 times income, right? And people go, you mean prices are going to collapse? And it feels like the end of the world, because we're so addicted to this disastrous housing market that they've created. So look, just to come back to the main point, they want to do this as a free market thing, and they're setting up Australia for disaster unless they take the bull by the horns and go, okay, we have to address this problem. There's ways to do it where you can minimise the impact on people, but we've got to show the public, no, we've got to make housing affordable again. That's the number one goal, because the next generation can't afford it.
Yeah. Now, before we make a couple of final comments, here's how you can find out more.
The narrow agendas of mainstream media outlets are not telling you the full story. The weekly Citizens Party Australian Alert provides in-depth insights into issues that matter to all Australians. The Australian Alert holds a mirror to those in the halls of power, reporting on issues of national importance that are being buried by the major parties. It's reported on the misconduct of banks and major corporates, the persecution of those doing their jobs, and the failure of regulators to do theirs. Economic coverage puts real issues on the political agenda. There's serious analysis of global issues, the Washington Insiders report, and the global threat from endless wars. Everything you should know every week is in the Australian Alert. Subscribe today for hard copy and digital versions.
And it was interesting, Robbie, in that committee that, and I'll talk more about this in future because we've run out of time for today, but there were a lot of submissions that bolstered that view that these tax gains were, just opening the sluice gates for speculation and something that should be primarily focused on the actual infrastructure of housing people. Yeah. But there were also a lot of submissions talking about, and this includes APRA and the RBA, talking about how with deregulation of the Australian financial system, the other sluice gate that was opened was bank credit galore into housing and particularly investment. And you hear today in the press some of the banks are re-evaluating their lending book for investment because these changes will affect it.
Well, Lisa, the day after the budget was announced, bank shares dropped quite sharply because analysts know that this has been cream for the banks. There's these being able to lend to investors against these tax advantage. And Westpac today is being reported, as you said, saying to its the people who are, or its you know, what do they call them, brokers, right? That's over, guys, right? That doesn't exist. Actually, the article about Westpac today shows just how much they were lending against the tax setting.
Yeah.
They shouldn't. I mean, this is, if you think
It's
about
not
something
reality.
that's crazy, you should have been lending against, do you need a house or not, right?
Yeah, exactly.
They were lending against the tax setting. So this is like, it's not just, the investors are making an investment. Every investment is a bit of a gamble. For the bank, it's like margin lending. They were lending to the speculators,
Yeah,
right?
for sure.
So that had to change, but this approach so far is not good enough. We need the government to step in and assume its rightful role in the economy. They don't want to do it because they're brainwashed neoliberals. So let's follow the debate in New Zealand about public bank, and let's see if that starts to influence the major parties' debate here, because we'll certainly be pushing it very hard. Citizens Party, Gerard Benning's People First Party, we are the champions of a national bank.
Yeah.
If we have that, if we achieve that,
Yep.
it'll transform everything.
That mission puts a real bright light on the horizon for something to aim for. So that's it for this week. Thanks, Robbie.
Thanks, Lisa.
And we'll see you again next week.